So how greasy are the hands that run our oil industry? We recently told you of the newly established South African National Petroleum Company. We are told this was to unlock over 95 billion rands worth of untapped investment opportunities in the country and obviously to secure our fuel security. But will it? It's an amalgamation of three previously independent entities, iGas, the Strategic Fuel Fund, and PetroSA. And it will likely not only inherit their personnel, but I'd imagine their problems too. Well, amaBhungane, the investigative journalism outfit, is set to publish a revealing exposé today as part of their Dirty Fuels series. And they want to shed light on particularly PetroSA and its secretive diesel trading business. The investigation focuses on a contentious 933 million rand deal, that's almost a billion, between PetroSA and a little-known company called Nagore Energy, which was awarded without a tender, lacked a legal contract, and no payment guarantees. And as a result, Eskom and electricity users, that's you in your car, who are PetroSA's biggest clients, may ultimately bear the cost of that reckless gamble on diesel trading. To explain it all, we are joined by Susan Comrie. She's a seasoned investigative journalist, and she and I, of course, worked together for many years at Carte Blanche, but she's now with the amaBhungane Center for Investigative Journalism. Susan, always a pleasure to have you on the show. Perhaps let's paint a picture of the context, right? PetroSA is a key part of this new energy company, but on its own, how big was it, and what kind of balance sheet does it come with to this new company?
Hi, Bongani. So PetroSA, it's a behemoth. It's a huge state-owned entity, and it flies below the radar most of the time. A lot of people don't, on a day-to-day business, think about our state-owned petroleum company. Well, as you've said, we now have two state-owned petroleum companies. We've got PetroSA, which will continue to exist in some form, plus we have the new South African National Petroleum Company, and a bunch of PetroSA's assets are going to be moved across into the new company. Some of the really problematic ones, the really toxic ones, are staying behind, but crucially, the fuel trading business, which has really it is PetroSA's sole business, essentially, at the moment, is moving across into the new company. And what does that take with it? From what we can tell, it's a roughly sort of 23 billion rand a year business. It's conducted in complete secrecy. And the few sort of looks that we managed to get inside, like the story that we've put out today, really paint a picture of how incredibly dysfunctional it is, how incredibly shambolic it is, how irregular it is. Right. And it really raises questions about how that tab is being picked up by Eskom and electricity users.
All right, we'll come back and try and connect it in terms of how it all fits in with electricity users, for example, and Eskom, because for a long time you could argue that PetroSA, because it lost its refining capacity, was technically insolvent, and then came along the gift of load shedding.
Yeah, absolutely. Load shedding has been, it's been a godsend for PetroSA. It's been not so great for the rest of the country. But essentially PetroSA, if you look at how their revenue has grown during the load shedding crisis, in 2019, when they were a business that was focusing on refining product, they had a turnover of around 11 billion rand. The load shedding crisis comes along and they essentially become a business that supplies Eskom with diesel, and their revenue has doubled to sort of 23 billion rand. The stats that we got out of Eskom is that over the last couple of years, more than 80% of the diesel that Eskom burns in the open cycle gas turbines is coming from PetroSA.
And that's how you and I, as electricity users, end up paying for it. All right, let's get to the nub of your story. Tell me about this Nagore Energy deal. How did it come about? Who are they and what did they get?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So Nagore is a company, we've been hearing their name for just about as long as they've been around. They were started in 2022, and they're sort of virtually unknown outside of PetroSA. But inside PetroSA, they seem to have become a kind of favored partner of PetroSA. Now, our assumption is that they were supplying PetroSA with diesel. It turns out that they've actually been supplying them with unleaded petrol, but they do sort of pop up in this investigation as the buyer of this huge cargo of diesel. Essentially how we got here is PetroSA has been wildly kind of buying up cargoes of diesel, pumping through as many cargoes as they could get through. But they weren't paying attention to whether they could actually sell those cargoes, whether they had storage for that fuel. And so what you can see that reflected in the financials, because we have something called demurrage costs, which is where you have a ship waiting offshore, waiting to discharge. Those costs in the last financial year went completely through the roof. PetroSA has had this strategy of sort of buying up and selling as much diesel as it could. What's happened is that they ended up in a situation where they suddenly had cargoes that they couldn't sell to Eskom because load shedding had suddenly come to a brief end. And they had to wildly kind of look around and try and find a buyer. And they settle on NARCO.
All right, so hold on, just to simplify it for us, Susan. So they were hedging all their bets on an unpredictable factor like load shedding. When Eskom then suddenly seems to be recovering, they've got all this fuel with nowhere to store it and no one else to buy it.
Yeah, I mean, look, they should have been able to offload it relatively quickly. Remember, we are a net importer of diesel as a country. There are a huge number of international oil companies operating in South Africa that they could have sold this cargo to. It's really unclear why they didn't just, on day one, pick up the phone and say, look, we're selling a cargo, who's going to take it off our hands? Instead, they enter into this incredibly protracted and complicated kind of arrangement with Nagore Energy, which ends up leaving them in a real pickle.
How much of this has all put a spotlight to Eskom's inability to buy its own diesel on the open market?
Yeah, I mean, you'll remember a couple of years ago, this is something that Andre de Ruyter, the then CEO, had brought up, is that Eskom wanted to be able to import their own diesel. Now, they had applied for a wholesale license, which is the first step towards getting an import license, so that they wouldn't have to be in the situation of buying from PetroSA. Now, I should just point out, PetroSA, this is not like country duty. PetroSA is not sort of giving this diesel to Eskom at cost price. PetroSA makes a significant markup when they sell this diesel to Eskom. We found another sort of memo that we got our hands on, gave an idea that PetroSA was going to make between sort of 30 and 50 million rand on a single cargo of diesel that they would sell to Eskom. So essentially, because Eskom cannot import its own diesel, it is left in a situation where it has to buy from other importers. The biggest being PetroSA, but it can also buy from sort of other international oil companies. But all of that comes at a cost. It's a huge amount of money that leaves Eskom every year as the profit margin on those diesel sales, unnecessarily, in my view.
So even deep in this crisis, this is how we are still managing it. All right, so where did the payment issue end up? What happened then to this 933 million agreement?
So essentially, after PetroSA has had these vessels, these oil tankers, floating around trying to find a home, eventually it agrees that it's going to sell the diesel to NARCO. Now, in order to buy a cargo of diesel, you have to have very basic things in place. You have to have payment guarantees to make sure this is a huge amount of money. I mean, as you said, it's almost R1 billion. Normally, a vessel doesn't even leave its port until those payment guarantees are in place. Except PetroSA now has this cargo floating around. It's costing PetroSA 650,000 rand every single day that it doesn't offload that diesel. So it ends up agreeing that it will sell the cargo to NARCO. NARCO seemingly doesn't have even a contract in place. That's what NARCO themselves told us. They're not able to put up any payment guarantees to show that they can pay for this diesel. Now, instead of PetroSA at that point saying, we're going to pull the plug, we're walking away from this deal, we will just sell it to any one of the other big buyers on the market, they persist. They're going to sell this cargo to NARCO. They eventually agree to give NARCO credit of 933 million rand, and they say, look, make sure you pay us in 60 days. We really need this money. course, NARCO doesn't pay. Almost a year later, PetroSA is still saying to NARCO, you owe us 825 million rand.
Gosh, how much is all of this complicated by the fact that PetroSA doesn't publish an annual report, doesn't disclose the names of companies that supply it with diesel or profit from these contracts? How much does that lack of transparency then contribute to this kind of deal with Nagore?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge problem at PetroSA, and it's one that we have been fighting to try and get them to disclose this information for the past 2 years.
Do you accept the explanation? Sorry, Susan, do you accept the explanation by the minister that this is all sensitive business material and therefore commercially, it doesn't make sense to disclose it?
We certainly do not. I mean, so this is something that we have taken to the information regulator to say, look, you have to comply with procurement laws in South Africa. You cannot, as a state-owned entity, simply decide that the laws do not apply to you. And that's essentially what PetroSA has been doing. If these deals are made public, and it doesn't have to be made public at the time, there is a mechanism in place to make this information public through Treasury, after the fact. If this is made public, this kind of thing doesn't happen because journalists, the public, Parliament, even Parliament is denied this information. They are able to stay on top of it and say, wait a second, who are we selling these cargoes of diesel to? What are we, or who are we buying them from in most of the situations? Yeah. And what are we paying for that diesel?
You can also
are we getting a fair price?
You can also imagine what it says about deals, for example, with the Russians. And of course, Susan, final question to you. Has anyone been held accountable, or are they going to be rewarded with even bigger positions in the new entity?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Look, it's certainly, there's no indication to me that PetroSA has learned its lesson from this, that they're going to turn over a new leaf. The minister on Friday was saying, the key to the new state-owned petroleum company is going to be good governance. I mean, that's a joke. The key so far at PetroSA has been complete secrecy, operating in the dark. I've reported on state capture cases for many years. And what we're seeing at PetroSA is very reminiscent. Deals done in the dark, strange, peculiar decisions being made, and ultimately, these kind of small companies getting huge benefits out of it.
It's the same story. It's the same movie. We've seen it before. Susan Comrie, appreciate it. Susan Comrie is from amaBhungane. You can read, of course, this piece that they're publishing today, amaBhungane Center for Investigative Journalism. Really a key factor, by the way, in unmasking so much of the state capture that we all came to know.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.